It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Flashenberg. Welcome to Yoga, Birth, Babies, a podcast produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. We will be diving into everything prenatal yoga, birth, and baby related, hoping to inspire, educate, and empower you through your journey into motherhood. Thank you for listening. Hi, I'm Deb Flashenberg. I am your host for Yoga Birth Babies, and today we're going to talk about birth inequities, and my guest is Rhea Williams. I came about this conversation with Rhea because she was doing a presentation on the same topic in an online conference with spinning babies. And the first time I watched it, I was scribbling down notes like a mad person, and then I would pause and I'd rewind it to make sure I heard everything and wrote more notes. And then I had the idea, I wonder if I could get Rhea to come on the podcast and give a similar presentation. And she said yes. So then I rewatched it again, and I got all these questions and ideas for our conversation, which I'm so excited for you to hear. Before we jump into that conversation, let me tell you a little bit about Rhea. She is a certified nurse midwife and enjoys providing care and support to pregnant people with holistic and integrative approach. She currently serves as a director of professional education and programming for spinning babies, and she's an approved trainer. So the presentation that she offered was so rich and so powerful, and she's going to share a fair amount of that. Some of the things she talks about, she gives current statistics of inequities in birth between Black and white birthers. She talks about the history of racism in healthcare and the impact of racism in healthcare. And she talks a lot about what happened during and after the Jim Crow time. We also start to talk about how to give the power back to Black women when they are birthing and what birth workers can do to help support that. Some really tangible tips she offers. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. It was a powerful conversation when I watched it, and I very much enjoyed having this conversation with Rhea in real time. Before we get to that, I wanted to say a special thank you to all those people who have been leaving rating and reviews for the podcast. It's helping people find us. I also want to say a special thank you because a lot of people are starting to come into our online classes, having heard about our classes from the podcast. It's always fun when I can connect to our listeners in that, I'm going to call it face-to-face, it's Zoom face-to-face in that manner. So thank you. And if you do show up to class having heard from the podcast, just let me know. I'd love to give you a special shout out. And then last thing I want to remind you, if you are interested in prenatal yoga and you're a pregnant person and you are having some aches and pains, I have a whole downloadable handout of 5 simple solutions for the pregnant body, covering some of the most common aches and pains. You can go to our website and download that. Okay, I know that I said that was the last thing, but now the very last thing. And don't forget, for yoga teachers, we've got our teacher training. It's really in-depth, it's really intense, and it's really a great way to dive into prenatal yoga. Okay, that's enough of me chatting. So let's take a beat, and when we come back, please enjoy my conversation with Rhea.
With Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to... Has anyone seen the bride and groom?
Sorry, we're here. We were getting lucky in the limo and we lost track of time.
No, Lucky Land Casino, with cash prizes that add up quicker than a guest registry.
In that case, I pronounce you lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Daily bonuses are waiting. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Hi, Rhea. How are you today?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited. So giving our listeners a little background of our back and forth is, we think it was June or July, we're supposed to together do a spinning babies workshop at PYC. And that didn't work out clearly, this whole COVID situation. And then I saw you on the Spinning Babies online conference, and I was just taken by what you were speaking about. So thank you for letting me hunt you down and get you on this podcast.
Oh, I am so happy to be here. I welcome the opportunity whenever we get to talk about birth. I'm like the quintessential birth addictive person. Like anything birth, I'm like, let's do it.
Yes. That's why we are kindred spirits in that way. So we're going to talk about birth inequities. Your presentation on the Spinning Babies conference was amazing. As I told you, I watched it in awe. I watched it again. I took notes. You present the information in such a digestible way that I just wanted everyone to get a deeper understanding of what you were talking about. So before we really dive into that, can we start with just hearing a little bit about you and how you got into birth work?
Yeah. So my story is actually a roundabout story. I started off eons ago teaching mathematics in junior high school for a program, a enrichment program. And I loved working with kids, but I knew that teaching at that level was not my thing, and I needed to figure out where I was going. At the age of 9, I knew I wanted to be involved with some type of birth. I thought that I wanted to be an OBGYN, but I always tell people midwifery kind of found me. I didn't go after it. It found me, and it was such a serendipitous relationship that I don't look back at all with regret. So I graduated from college with a degree in math eons ago, and then I got married and moved overseas to Japan for 3 years. My time spent in Japan was like a really big eye-opener to cultural differences, because growing up in New York, in coming to Maryland, it was like, okay, well, the difference between a little bit of a slower pace, and people don't really see a slower pace in Maryland. I'm like, yeah, if you're a New Yorker, you get the fact that there's a slower pace there. Let me tell you. And living over there and seeing how food really impacted the way of being differently than it did in America. Because I always tell Americans, I said, we have the SAD diet. And they're like, SAD? Our diet isn't SAD. I'm like, it's the standard American diet. That's the acronym. Isn't that ironic? And I spent my time when I came back to the States and said, hey, I want to do nutrition, but I want to focus specifically on the pregnant population and the little newborns and infants, and working on their nutritional needs. So in doing that, I spent time working as a nutritionist in Washington, D.C., and I loved it. And I love everything about nutrition and that navigation of that relationship of how food is really medicine. But I needed more. I was like, well, I'm getting to them now in this aspect, but I want to really be a part of their birth. So that led me to nursing school, because I spent some time really shadowing some physicians in the area when I came back to the States, and it just didn't sit with me. I was like, well, I don't really, something's not right here. It just doesn't feel like my soul. Then I went to nursing school, and at that same time I was having my babies, and the difference between the care that I was given when I was under midwifery care versus physician care, and there's nothing wrong with physicians. I absolutely love my OBGYNs and the GYNs that provide me care, but there was just a difference in the amount of education, patient education that they provided, and the self-efficacy that they instilled in me, that midwifery found me then. So then I was hooked. And ever since then, that became my quest. And going through midwifery nursing school, there was something missing from the education, where we knew the idea of being present with women, but to really understand the conceptualization of what's happening in the body and putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, that didn't click until I went to my first Spinning Babies workshop, I think, 7 years ago, with one of I call her my school wife. She's still one of my dearest friends, because we're going to be working together, and we've been midwives ever since. She's my classmate, but following Spinning Babies and really seeing how it works and understanding that what's happening with the anatomy, where's the baby held up, it clicked. And I have been hooked ever since, trying to look outside of where our traditional education places us and understand how the deep parts of the anatomy and the tendons, the ligaments, the balancing, all those things really impact birth. So that's a long route to how I got to be where I am today. And I love working with Gail on the inside. And I've recently taken on a little bit more of a management role in addition to teaching workshops. And they gave me the opportunity to come on board as a director of professional programming and education, which I'm very honored to do. So that's been a great transition in my career. And I still catch babies, although I'm in influx waiting because of COVID. Credentialing takes time for certain hospitals.
Well, I love every part of that story. And I think the listeners know that I am a major adoring fan of spinning babies. I've had Gail on twice. I use a lot of the principles in my teaching. I also had a first birth that he came out, but it was we never leave them in.
Right.
But it was a very long, arduous birth. And when I then discovered how torqued things were inside, it just became my mission to really understand balancing the soft tissue, the bony pelvis, and how that can affect babies. So I love spinning babies. And I was saying earlier, I'm like, one of my goals is to become one of the spinning babies parent educators. I'm so excited about that, but that's for a different podcast, right? So
I'm looking forward to that, bringing you on board.
I am so excited. So when I was watching the conference, you did an amazing presentation on birth inequities. And it's something, as I was telling you before, I was reading Medical Bondage, and I was really started an interest in this. But the way you presented it, I don't know, it just hit home in a different way. So as I was watching your presentation, I took notes. So, so these are kind of the questions based on what I saw that I think people may want to hear. So just let's start with just some of the current statistics, because they're shocking. The statistics are shocking, and it's just a great way to see already just, wow, there are inequities between Black and white birthers. Can you start by just offering some of these current statistics that we're looking at?
Absolutely. So the biggest thing is that Black women are more likely to die than her white counterpart giving birth. And that is more than twice as likelihood of death than her white counterpart. And you still see this same this disproportion, even when you account and adjust for age and socioeconomic status. That's what's really shocking about those numbers. It's because they still exist, and it is really right down to the skin color. And what made it even more pressing is that a Caucasian woman with a great school education, she's less likely to die in childbirth than a African-American female that has a high level of education. Because the thought process could have been one of those trains of thought to say, hey, well, it's probably the lack of education that's influencing the outcomes and their lack of adherence. No, we actually have to take a dive back into the history to understand why why education is not a mitigating factor here. And we're looking at the CDC maternal mortality from 2018. Let's just take a breakdown of that. 14.7 deaths per 100,000 live births. That's the statistical number you have for Caucasian women. That same exact 100,000 births, you'll have 37.1 Black women die. 37.1 compared to the 14.7. That's a lot. That's nearly triple. And that gap, and that's just kind of a quick snapshot, because I haven't even addressed the fact that gap actually widens when you talk about adding age factors into that. And the most shocking thing about these numbers when I sat there preparing that presentation for Spinning Babies is the fact that 60% of those deaths are avoidable. 60%. That is a lot. So if you take that number, 60% of that 37.1, they could have been saved. they could have been saved. And why it's happening is understandable, but it is heartbreaking at the same time. And I struggled putting this presentation together to sit in my own emotions.
Those numbers are just shocking. I want to go deeper into pulling apart, especially the education. But I guess you mentioned something as you were giving that about the history. So maybe before we start to look into how medical decisions are made, why education's not mattering, which seems crazy, let's step back. And do you mind sharing some of the history of racism in our healthcare?
So I often try to have this conversation with students that I precept, and I start by telling them, say, hey, did you know that a Black woman was more valuable to a slave owner than her partner as a Black man? And they looked at me kind of perplexed, and they said, well, why is that? I said, well, because breeding existed, and they breed more slaves. So that's something that I'm going to address upon in a minute, and as to why and how that changed after the end of slavery. But if we just take a step back into how we even got to just the concept of having a C-section. Let's just talk about C-sections for a minute. You have Francois Marie Prevost. He's the pioneer of the cesarean section. How did that come to be? That's the one question I put. How did that happen? Well, that's because of repeated experimentation on enslaved women, and oftentimes without medicine for pain. That's the big thing. So they would do repeated education on that. James Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, was well known for the surgical techniques that we learn about in the textbook. Experimenting on slaves without anesthesia. If you Google his name, you'll see this image of a good group of white males standing around his slave. And it looked like she was there, not necessarily willfully, but without the pain and without just sitting there on her knees on the table while everybody's gawking at her. But that's not truly what happened. You're missing the fact that these surgical techniques were done on her repetitively, time and time again, without pain medicine, so that they can have the betterment to add to their textbook, to add to their learning, to go and perform the same technique to a white woman with anesthesia, because anesthesia was still there. It may not have been what we know it to be today, of course, but it was still there. But they were not given that opportunity and that same dignity and respect. Even now, in our education, if I look back into some of my old textbooks and Pearson's education, they've since issued an apology. We even have that bias that exists to say, well, Black people don't experience pain as much as other ethnic groups.
Where did that come from?
You know, and I searched for an answer as to find that fact, and I could not figure out where the origin of that came from. And the only thing that I can logically think about is the fact that you go back to the history of practicing on these enslaved women without the pain medication, and they didn't die the first go round. They didn't die the second go round. So there goes that perception that, oh, okay, well, they must have tolerated that surgery a little bit better than the Caucasian counterpart. So maybe that's how that came to be. I mean, in the Pearson textbooks, you will see quotes that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures. That is a really big bias right there, because that bias leads individuals to disregard that pain response. We are often taught in education to account for pain the way that it is presented for the person. If the person rates their pain as a 5 and they're putting their makeup on, that doesn't mean that their pain is actually a 1 by your perception. It means that their pain is a 5. Mm-hmm. But because our textbooks, our nursing textbooks that were published to say, well, this class of individuals, these Black people do not have pain as much as they say they have pain. That's essentially what that statement is saying. They disregard it. And that makes a big difference in life or death, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to keep going with the history of it, so we have the slavery that happened and the practicing on slaves. But after slavery ended, Black women lost their value. because they no longer were needed to breed more slaves. So what happened? Then you have the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. She pioneered what they called internally the Negro Project, which placed birth control centers in specific areas in the Black South because of the fact that you have people that believe, like W.E. Du Bois said, Black people breed carelessly and disastrously. And then you have the forced sterilization that they really refer to as the Mississippi appendectomy in the 1930s. Individuals that would go into the hospital with pain and they have surgical procedures related to whatever differential diagnosis they had at that time, they would go in and sterilize Black women. Think about how that's really going to impact generational bias towards going to seek health care. Mm-hmm. They went in because they were having pain and they had, appendicitis, for example. They went under anesthesia. They came out of anesthesia with their appendix removed and no longer able to conceive a baby. And they had no idea. No consent, no idea. And you figured it would stop in the 1930s, but it didn't. It just continued on. I mean, I remember in the 1990s, and thank goodness that this did not pass, but we have Norplant. They specifically tried to get Black teenagers in specific Baltimore schools they targeted the marketing to get those individuals to get Norplant. They even tried to pass legislation to incentivize birth control among women on welfare. Thank God that never passed. I mean, and then you think about Jim Crow segregation. That's a whole nother ball game there. So there's so much history involved as to why this is happening that it makes sense why we as Black women do not trust a system that we need to trust with our lives. And because of how we are treated sometimes.
So would you say that's one of the biggest impacts of racism in healthcare is the lack of trust?
So that's a really loaded question because there's a couple of things that can really fall into that. So I definitely think that the history presents, it's like a cause and effect. That's the way I think about it. I always tell people, I'm like, when we go through spinning babies, what you see in the intrapartum period is the effect. What you really need to get at is the cause. And the cause is what happened during that prenatal period. So that cause for racism or, what we're dealing with among the racial disparities really boils down to that history and how that has impacted generations. Because a baby's born very innocent. How that baby is raised reflects the parenting. And if you have an individual that was taught from a young age to say, do not trust this system because they don't take care of us and they have just cause to do so, that's going to be passed down from generation to generation. It's going to be very challenging to break that mold. I see that oftentimes in my mother. And that's part of the pieces, but then there's also the idea of advocating for oneself or the idea of really educating oneself. There's so many things. I do want to step back and go a little bit deeper into Jim Crow for a second.
Yeah, please do.
With Jim Crow, we have the segregation, and I don't know if people know that applied to healthcare too. There were hospital segregations. They had specific wards for African-American Black individuals. Some hospitals didn't even have wards for people of color. So think about that. If you have hospitals that don't have wards for people of color and they can't get the same care in the same hospital floor that their Caucasian counterpart can, what is their risk of death if the hospital next to them is not near, if it's far away? Or are they getting the same care? They were not getting the same care, I can tell you that. So these things all play into fact. My mother lived through some of these things. She's in her late 70s, and that's just really daunting. She lived through some of these things. And she can talk about her experiences, and it influences her healthcare. I will speak firsthand. My mother had a heart attack because she didn't believe the doctor about her blood pressure and decided she was going to treat it with apple cider vinegar instead of the antihypertensives that she was prescribed, because she did not trust the system. And it's because of the fact that she lived through these things that influenced what her outcomes were. And thank heaven she lived through that heart attack, and she's been doing great for the past 6 years. But think about how that affects people in birth.
Will you go deeper into that?
Absolutely. So we have to understand how the history really impacts our outcomes. And we've seen actually a slight little increase in individuals dying in childbirth, especially with COVID. What happens and what you'll see is that we have broken trust in the system because we were used as experimentation. And when we're used as experimentation, we're not going to trust anything. It's really interesting how I have the conversation with individuals like, you're going to get the COVID vaccination? I'm like, I don't know. I'll wait and see. Because even though they may have tested, you don't have a lot of African Americans really signing up for that research to participate for that same exact reason. We have a real apprehension against a healthcare system that used us as guinea pigs to provide better care to other ethnic groups. I mean, I didn't even think twice when I sat here and went through this history. I mean, it really touched me, because it's like I have to live in that space. And that book that you're reading through right now was a very difficult read. Mm-hmm. Very difficult read to live through. And going through this history is a very difficult read, but it needs to be there. It needs to be a part of our education for individuals and any birth work to understand why the system is so broken. And because the fact that we don't have trust, we don't necessarily voice what we're experiencing. We may hide that fact. We may downplay it. We may say we're completely fine because we don't want to take a particular medicine because we are not sure what the efficacy of it is, or we don't feel like we're being heard. I've heard that many times before. And just the simple fact that there's birth trauma there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of birth trauma among African American women because of the fact that they experience these things and they sometimes stop having children because of it.
I just did a podcast covering the LGBTQ community where there was a study that a lot of trans folks chose not to have medical support because of the judgment and the fear and the stigma. And it feels very relatable for Black folks to kind of have the same thing, that they don't want to put themselves in the hands of a system that has betrayed them. Is that a good correlation in a sense?
It is. And not only that, that they want to see a like face.
Yeah.
They want to see a like face. And there are not many statistically, and I cannot remember the number off the top of my head, but African American midwives are few and far between. I am a minority within my group, and to also have advanced education, I'm less than 1% of the individuals that's seeking a PhD as an African American woman who identifies as a female who is a midwife. And if I am one of the majority, and you have African American women looking for African American providers because that gives them a little bit of hope that they can trust in that provider, then what is that going to do to their healthcare if they can't find that provider and then they go to see whomever they have access to? So we're also tasked with trying to increase the diversity among midwifery education or among midwives, because that demand is there. I know I left a practice, and I know a couple of my other counterparts left a practice, and our patients followed us because they did not have the diversity anymore. Our patients followed us. And I myself, I will speak firsthand. I felt more at ease with a a provider of color. And I didn't sit in that truth until I realized that that was the majority of providers that I actually saw. And I expressed my concerns. There's a difference, because I'll see whoever at the end of the day for my healthcare, especially in women's. I'm like, I just need a pap smear and a women's health checkup. Let me get it done. But I found when I took an inventory of myself, because it's really hard to sit back and take an inventory of your own biases. It's really revealing that when I would go to see my African-American counterparts for my healthcare, I just came out with everything that I was experiencing, and I felt heard. I don't know if I was actually truly heard. I'm not saying that the listening is different among the two, but I'm simply saying I felt like I was in a safe space.
That's really important. I would definitely want to go into that because I had some notes about how healthcare providers can make sure they're really listening. But before we get to that, I want to take a quick break. And when we come back, if we can dive into why death related to childbirth is higher for Black birthing people, we're going to dive into that. We'll take a quick break. We'll come right back.
Hey guys, it is Ryan. I'm not sure if you know this about me, but I'm a bit of a fun fanatic when I can. I like to work, but I like fun too. It's a thing. And now the truth is out there. I can tell you about my favorite place to have fun. Chumba Casino. They have hundreds of social casino style games to choose from with new games released each week. You can play for free anytime, anywhere. And each day brings a new chance to collect daily bonuses. So join me in the fun. Sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
This podcast is sponsored by Skylight Calendar. Let's be real. Running a household can be exhausting and chaotic. And finding the perfect Mother's Day gift, it's not exactly a no-brainer. Until now. The Skylight Calendar is the best way to organize the family and give everyone, especially mom, some peace of mind to enjoy the things that matter most. The Skylight Calendar is a smart, touchscreen calendar that keeps track of and manages the chores, dinner planning, groceries, and to-dos for the whole family. The Skylight Calendar automatically syncs each family member's digital calendars and displays them all together on one color-coded touchscreen. It even doubles as a digital picture frame, so you can finally share all those special moments that are just sitting on your phone. As a limited-time offer for our listeners, get 15% off your purchase of a Skylight Calendar when you go to skylightcal.com/easy. That's SKYLIGHTCAL.com/easy. Get 15% off your Mother's Day purchase now at skylightcal.com/easy.
Okay, so we're back. So I have some big questions for you. I'm throwing it at you. So why is death related to childbirth higher for Black birthing people?
Gosh, the one thing that I can really think of, well, actually there's a lot of things that I can think of, but that's like a lot to unpack in the time that we have, is the concept of being heard. Number one, they don't feel like they're listened to. Number two, when they have a symptom, they ignore the symptom. Number three, if you look at the areas where you have a high density of African-American birth givers, you have more clinics. And sometimes in those clinics, you have higher waiting times. And that's a factor. They're sitting there in the waiting room. I remember when I was in nursing school, I got to participate as a research assistant, and I went to a clinic to go ask questions. And I sat in that clinic all day because that was my job, to sit there all day and ask questions. And women waited for so long in that waiting room. Think about how often that they'd adhere to their care if they have to wait longer. They're less likely to show up for visits because they have to wait all day and they have to think about childcare. And the fact that the actual appointments are overloaded. I mean, I had 10 to 15 minutes with a person, 10 to 15 minutes to get everything done that I needed to get done. And I always go over and end up late because I need to hear what somebody has to say. It is important for me to hear what you have to say and know that you're heard, and not just hear as oh, I hear the words that you're saying. Really listen. Mm-hmm. But if you take the fact that Kira, for example, I talked about her birth and her death.
Mm-hmm.
A healthy African-American woman gave birth via cesarean section only to die 12 hours later. And her husband was there and watched it all unfold. A healthy woman, very little issues during her pregnancy, bled out. She had blood in her catheter, and her husband was like, hey, there's something going on here. Watch the color drain from her body. But the thing that got me the most when I watched that story is that he said he didn't know how to advocate for her because he didn't want to be perceived as just an angry black man.
That's what I remember hearing that. And I literally got, again, I have it right now. I have the goosebumps. I mean, cause he was a big man and I could see his hesitation and devastation. Oh my gosh. That's just something.
That is not Judge Judy. I can't think of her name. Her son, his mother is very famous. They are highly educated and they are in a good socioeconomic standing. So this affluent couple, his mother is well known in the TV world, a well-known judge, still died at birth, was still ignored. That is unreal. And then to have her husband, to have him say, I was scared to react because I did not want to be a stereotype. That's insane. That's a lot to take in. I'll tell you about my cousin. She knew her midwife, and the day that she told me this happened, I was like, I'm going to choke you. She gave birth to twins, and she had a relatively normal pregnancy, and days after she gave birth, she had an eclamptic seizure. And I said to her, I said, what, did you have headaches? She was like, oh yeah, I had a really big headache, but I didn't want to bother the doctor. And I was like, oh my God, that's insane to me. Why would you not bother them? Well, I was going the next day and I knew that they're busy. That says a lot. That means that you didn't advocate for yourself. And not only that, you just ignored your symptoms. And it almost cost her life. A healthy 30-plus-year-old female gave birth to these beautiful twins, almost died. And she didn't even want to reach out to me. And I was like, never do that again. It's insane. I have another story of one of my son's dearest friends that is no longer has a mother because she died in birth. She died hours after giving birth via cesarean section. And it's just unclear what happened. I remember her distinctively sitting in my house weeks before at our barbecue, as if we can go back to that again. I can't wait. Sitting in my house, just ready to have this baby. And I was excited for her. And just to see that she did not survive because maybe her symptoms were ignored. Maybe they dismissed it. You have Serena Williams. They dismissed her.
Mm-hmm.
That says a lot. A famous woman that had a clot before, knows the symptoms. They dismissed it. I say to the nurses that I teach all the time, I said, you are never to dismiss what somebody says because you put your own bias on it. Know your biases before you walk in the room and leave them at the door.
This is just crazy. I'm so appreciative that you're sharing this. One thing you talked about in your presentation was about the physician's implicit views of Black people and how that affected clinical decision making. Can you go into that?
Oh boy. So, that is a lot to when I talk about that, the one thing I think about what happened when we had our education textbooks, and we have this systemic education that teaches us that these individuals may not be adherent to care, or this particular person is going to be non-compliant with her medicine, or she isn't really feeling what she's feeling. Oh, or the best yet is, I've seen it happen in cesarean sections, for example. No, you're not feeling pain right now in your chest. What you're feeling is you're feeling the physicians do what they need to do to get the baby out. How do you know? How do you know what she is feeling in her body? Now, I'm not saying that you may not feel the pressure from them taking the baby out during a cesarean section, but these are things that I've seen and witnessed time and time again. And that implicit bias is really dismissive. I've had individuals firsthand just completely dismiss the idea of informed consent, and just go ahead and do a cervical exam and say, I'm going to do this. And I always say to an individual, you're not going to do anything unless a person tells you you're going to do something. So you ask. It's their body, their life, not yours. Your job is to take your knowledge that you have and meet the person where they are so that they can make an informed decision. And when they take the role of the provider and place it into actually the role of a knowledge educator, that actually changes the dynamic. And I can go on and on about the things that occur and the things that I see have happened because of what our education teaches us. And it's just really heartbreaking.
Do you think it's changing?
I do think it's changing, but I think it's changing very slowly because I think it's hard for individuals to recognize their own bias.
I mean, are the textbooks changing?
Well, Pearson had to go back and issue an apology and remove all that content. And I don't know if the textbooks really pay homage to the history of obstetrical and gynecological medicine or midwifery care, even in itself. I don't know. And I don't know if they choose not to go into the deep dive because it's such a hard thing to recognize. I mean, you're really asking an individual to recognize the reason why they're doing the surgical procedure is because it was done on a slave without medicine time and time again until they perfected the technique.
So you're thinking that, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around this, that there can be many OBGYNs and midwives that don't know the history of what they're practicing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking about this now as my son is going through high school, and I'm like, tell me about your history education. And you are only as educated as the education you choose to receive.
Mm-hmm.
And this was not in my midwifery education. This idea of what happened was not in my midwifery education.
So how are people, I'm just wondering, like, how can things change? What are some tangible things that we can do as a society?
So, it's hard for me to say that you need to know your history because I can't pretend like it's easy to unpack what was really done.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. People know about the syphilis trials and how those things happen. Yes. I talk about that in research when I taught that. But to really unpack that, you have to look in the mirror and look at yourself and deal with your own biases. The first thing I tell people is, look, what are your biases? And they look at me like, I don't really have any. Every woman is one and the same, but are they? Are you treating them the same? And it even boils down to when you're taking care of a doula client, because I used to be a doula, do you spend the same amount of time hands-on with an individual regardless of their color? Or are you spending more time on your cell phone? Because I've seen that happen too. Are you spending more time on your cell phone than you are with the person? Are you doing that equivocally? What are your biases? You need to know them because that's the only way you can check yourself. And the easiest thing that we can say to do is the hardest thing that we can actually do. That is listening. I mean, that is the most challenging thing to actually do. I mean, if you think about it, we can have a conversation about any particular thing, and as soon as I start talking, or as soon as my husband starts talking, and I have to check myself sometimes on this, I could think about, okay, what is my response going to be in my head? It is such a subconscious, automatic response that once that switch goes on and you start thinking about what your response is, you have absolutely just stopped listening. You've absolutely just stopped listening. You hear what you want to say. You hear the fact that you've asked an individual, is her baby moving? And as soon as she says yes, you're like, okay, I'm moving on to my next line of questioning. But did she say yes, not as much, or yes, the baby's been moving great? Sometimes that change is a big deal. And if you're not practicing active listening, you've missed what has come after that yes. And if you've missed what has come after that yes, that can be the difference between you sending a person home to come back for their appointment in a week or so with a live baby and a dead baby. Because yes, not so much movement is a big difference.
What are some steps as birth workers and care providers, because you're talking about listening, and that's super important, to increase how we listen?
Yeah, so that is a big task. And I always tell people, start with the ones you love. Start with the ones you love.
Oh, my husband's going to like that answer.
Because they'll still love you even though you don't listen. That's the biggest thing. First thing you have to do is stop what you're doing. Make eye contact with the person. Now, sometimes I will say there are certain cultures, and I cannot remember off the top of my head, that eye contact is taboo. But for your purposes, unless they explicitly say, it's not a cultural thing for me, make eye contact with the person. Put your phone down. Stop typing on your computer and charting. Look at the person. Do not stand over the person. Stand or sit at the level that they are at. Let them get their words out. Do not interrupt them. And part of active listening really involves asking questions. And asking specific questions that deal with what was said, because you need to clarify. Yes, but the baby is not moving as much. Okay, so what I hear you saying is your baby isn't moving as much. Please tell me about your baby's activity. Is it moving just the same as it would after you're eating? Or is it moving not as much? What do you do to elicit the baby's movements? So you're honing in on what the person said because you took a moment, you heard what they said, you cleared your mind. I always tell people, if your mind is full of your thoughts, stop, sit up straight, take a deep breath, exhale. Exhale and reset your mind. And you need to show that you understand them, not that you heard them, but that you understand them. That's a real big difference. And that's just a tiny difference on words, but a big difference in application. Because an individual that says that her baby is moving, but not as much, what does she mean by that? Don't reiterate her words per se, but show that you understand after you've asked your active listening question, so to speak. And you want to listen without judgment. And if that voice in the back of the head is telling you, oh yeah, I'm sure the baby's moving just fine, there is your judgment speaking. Mm-hmm. Because we often are told we shouldn't be looking for zebras in horse fields. But that's actually judgment in itself. That's actually a judgment in itself. Like one of the people that I've interacted with in the course of my midwifery life said that to me. And I said to myself, I was like, well, sometimes it actually may just be a zebra. You know, it may. And if we're not listening to them and not really trying to understand what they're saying, they may come back in a body bag. And listen to the nonverbal communication. That's really hard. People are like, wait, how can you listen to nonverbal communication? Active listening involves your eyes and your ears. What is that person saying? Is that person that's saying, yeah, my baby's not moving that much? What does her face look like? What is her body doing? Is it tensing up? I mean, we pay attention to nonverbal cues when a person is laboring, when we're providing labor support with them. Why are we not doing that more, regardless of the environment that we're in? And you want to make sure you're creating a suitable environment. My biggest pet peeve is if you're standing close to the door, I need you to go sit down someplace. Because if you're standing close to the door, that is telling that person that you're ready to leave the room. And therefore, what they have to say is not as important. Regardless of how well-intentioned you are, get away from that door. The other thing is, I often do not have individuals get undressed, because how comfortable are they going to feel completely naked when we're just in the conversation part of a visit? And I also tell people, don't put your hands on somebody until they've really said yes.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says yes, and I say this all the times in the workshops I teach, if somebody says yes, what is their body saying? What is their body saying? I remember when I was pregnant with my son, which was my first pregnancy, and I had to fly back from Japan. And that was a long, long flight. And my husband was still back in Japan because he had a little bit of time, but I just couldn't fly at the time where he had to PCS back to the States for his new duty station. Got back to the States, and I just felt very uncomfortable, and I knew I needed to say something because I was being taken care of by midwives, and that's something I'll definitely talk about in terms of why I felt safe to say something. And I said, hey, I don't think my son is moving as much, and I'm feeling this pain in my leg. They knew because I articulated where I was coming from in the appointment, and they sent me to the hospital.
Was it a blood clot?
No, it actually did not end up being anything serious, and thank heavens, it was just like my legs were done with carrying a not small baby and dealing with a big Labrador retriever flying back to the States, 20-something hours of flying, and just exhausted. Thank heavens for that. But I get to the hospital, and I'm in triage, and the nurse is talking to me, and she's doing a phenomenal job. In walks the resident, and the resident puts her hand on my knee and said, well, it's standard procedure that we check every single person that comes through. And before I can even get a word out edgewise, she proceeded to try to check my cervix. And I looked at her in absolute awe, and I was like, I didn't even get a chance to say a word edgewise. Now, at the time, I was in complete shock. But that was an extreme violation. And is that the culture of the place? I don't know. What I do know is I said, no, you're not going to touch my body. But that's because I knew to say no.
And that's so hard to do. It is so hard to take one's power back.
Yeah. And that's the other thing about it. We have a very big role in listening. So let me just finish out the listening part, because the last thing I want to say about listening is you definitely want to people watch. I love to tell people, I want you to people watch and see how people interact with one another.
Oh, I miss seeing people.
Right, exactly. We'd often used to go and get dinner every Friday and go sit outside at the park in Maryland where I live and just watch people. You get to learn a lot about the nature of the human interaction by just watching people. I send every single student that I precept. I said, no, you're not going to follow me. What you're going to do is you're going to go and sit inside of that labor room with that laboring individual. They're like, why? She's not dilated. She's not doing anything. I'm like, because you need to see what her body is doing. And that's what's going to help you be a better midwife. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that is something that's really important with listening. And in terms of, we were just talking about kind of taking your body back, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is another thing. Our role as birth workers, regardless of where you work and what you do, You can be a chiropractor, physical therapist, a doula, a health coach, a prenatal instructor, anything. Your job is to take the onus off of yourself and put the onus on the individual. And that sounds like, oh, well, you're not taking any responsibility for your actions. I said, that's not what I said. What I said very clearly is you shift the power from you to them. They need to be empowered to know what is happening with their body, know what is normal versus abnormal, and know that they have the ability to say something if something is not right and demand an answer that they clearly understand. You'll hear me say it time and time again when I teach. I said, is this fifth grade? Because you're telling me stuff that is medical and that is wonderful. I know what you mean, but that's because I know what you mean. Is this fifth grade language? You need to make sure it is digestible and attainable, because at the end, I want somebody to leave my care knowing about their entire pregnancy and pregnancy in general. I don't want to say, oh, okay, that's normal. Oh, okay, that's normal. I don't want to normalize what they see to be an abnormal situation in their life. I want them to understand what is happening in their body as to why this is present.
So some tangible things to help birth workers and care providers and all the people that work with the pregnant person to help. What would those tangible things be to help transfer the role of power back to the birthing person?
Okay. So the first thing I typically tell people, I'm like, hey, did you guys know that knowledge is power, but it's also your biggest enemy?
Explain that.
Yeah. So I tell people, I was like, look, I went through nursing school and I went through midwifery school with the same textbooks you did. But in that textbook, the person that you're sitting in front of right now, they're not in that textbook. You know, Mrs. Joe Smith is not in my textbook. She is still Mrs. Joe Smith. In the textbook, we learn about the general concepts. In front of a person, we learn about who they are and what our knowledge is and how that can apply to them. It's just like we take the things in Spinning Babies and we relate them back to the individual. You have to take what you know and use it as your tool to understand through active listening what the person is experiencing, and take that information and invite them for an opportunity of education so that they can understand within their body what is happening and whether or not it is normal and what to do about it and what the results of that will be. If a person is experiencing nausea, we know the first trimester they're going to feel like a bunch of bleh. That's the best thing. I'm like, ugh. That's what they feel like. I'm like, whatever you do during the first trimester, all I want you to do is survive it. Take care of yourself. I mean, people really get up in arms with me about that because I don't talk about nutrition in the first trimester. I just talk about food safety because I just want you to get through it. But I also want them to understand when they're ready why they're experiencing nausea and what to expect and when that's going to end. I don't want to just ever say to them, it's normal, because in my head, I know it's a normal finding because of the hormonal fluctuations that happen in the first trimester that causes that excess HCG and causes the nausea from all of those hormonal changes. But if I don't articulate that to the person, I've just dismissed their concern. That's step one. First trimester, I'm already dismissing their concerns as normal, instead of addressing them as opportunities for education. Mm. If I address the opportunity for education, when we get to that third trimester and she's starting to have palpitations because she may be anemic, she's going to be more likely to say something to me about it because I didn't dismiss her all along that period in time and saying, well, that just happens in pregnancy. Well, that just, that's the worst thing that you can say to a person is, well, that just happens in pregnancy.
I hear that a lot from my students. I mean, a lot from my students, because I'm always reminding them that I can give feedback because I do have, a fair bit of background in perinatal, but I'm not a doctor or a midwife. So I'll say, here's what I think, but I'm not a doctor or midwife. Please check with your care provider. And then I'd love to hear what they say. And many times I get them saying, oh, they said that was normal. And I'm like, okay, but I'm like, it feels so dismissive. Yes, I guess there is something to feel, okay, it is normal. I guess I don't have to really worry, but it also just feels dismissive.
It is very, very dismissive. It is such a dismissive term that I think has become much more of the normal because of the fact that our medical system only allows us a certain amount of time with an individual. And I don't think that that's an excuse to just dismiss somebody. That may be the best thing that they think that they're saying as reassurance, but it is the actual worst thing to do to create that shift of power. And while there's so many other things that's going on in terms of why the maternal mortality is the way it is, we have to look at what we can do as an individual. And these are things that we can actually do as an individual. Shift the role of power, and you need to educate, and you need not to dismiss a person by saying that is normal. You need to educate them. You can say that can commonly happen. That may be normal, but because of XYZ ABC is happening, don't just say it's normal and go on with your course of what you need to do with your visit, because you have this agenda that's already sitting in your head before you enter into the door that you need to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
The worst thing that a person can do, in my mind, and I know I've gone back and forth with some people about this, some clinicians about this, is that they've already got the person that's come through triage. They've already done their blood work. They've already done this, that, and a third. They've already got their differential diagnosis, but yet still they have not touched the person. They have not talked to the person. They have not looked at the person. But yet and still you're telling me that what you see in a computer is the full story.
Right. Wow. I'm just like taking this all in. I was trying to be an active listener. I'm just taking it all in. Wow, you've really covered so much. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, if you can offer one final tip or piece of advice you'd like to give new or expectant parents, unless there's still anything that I haven't asked you about in this really big topic.
Okay, definitely.
All right, we'll be right back.
Brighten up your space and save big money at Menards. Accent any area with Patriot lighting. From under-cabinet lighting to string lights, tape lights, and more. We've got a great selection of accent lighting options. Whether you're looking to light up the yard for your next get-together or add a splash of color to your gaming setup, Patriot Lighting has it all. Explore our lighting options and other great deals now at Menards and on Menards.com.
Save big money at Menards.
Okay, we are back. So is there anything else that you want to share, or are you ready for one final tip? And I'm totally open. I have no time limit. You tell me where you want to go.
If I was a birthing parent now, I would want to know that my provider has my best interest at heart, which is we have the Hippocratic Oath, great. But they also treat me like they have my best interest at heart. And I want you as the birthing parent to know that you have that right to be heard. Regardless of when your time is up, per se, in your visit, you need to have your answers. And I hate Google for that reason. You can have Google and that will diagnose you with death.
Oh my God, it really does, doesn't it?
It's like, I'm dying. I mean, at the beginning of COVID, I thought I was dying every time I had an allergy attack. Okay, I was like, I've got COVID this time. That's it. I'm dying. The biggest thing that you can do as a birthing parent and a birthing team, and the why I say as a team is because whoever you and your partner is that's going through this, your support person, advocate for yourself. Get your answers from the source. And if the source is they're referring you to a website, okay, great. Then they refer you to a website. But do not leave or do not settle for it's normal if you're not okay with that answer. And if it doesn't sit right in your gut, then you're not okay with that answer. You have the right to understand what's happening within your body. And for the birth workers out there, regardless of your field, you're knowledged, you're educated based off of whatever field in birth work you work at, and you have a responsibility to actively listen and to transfer the role of power onto the person that you're providing care to, regardless of your role. Regardless of your role, that is one of your big responsibilities, in addition to providing safe care and all of those lovely things. But by the end of pregnancy, the person that you're caring for should really know about the pregnancy and what is normal versus not normal and what to expect from you as a source.
Oh, that's such great information. I really love, as you talk about the transfer of role of power, it's something that in my classes, I'm constantly reminding them that I just give the suggestions and they make the decisions that they need to. And it's so hard. It's thrown out so much about, oh, just listen to your body. But if you've never been invited to have that conversation, it's hard. So I like to think start on the yoga mat where there's not it's a very low bar, so that they can flex that muscle so they can start to honor where they're being pulled and what their gut's telling them. So it's not just about a yoga pose, but it's a conversation. It's really trusting that instinct. So I'm really appreciative of your putting out there the role of power.
Yeah, it's a big one to take in because we want to own that power. And I get it. That's how we were bred, but that's actually not my role.
No,
it's not my role.
It's to help them find their power.
Absolutely. And some of the nurses that I used to work with will tell you some of my patients were quite perplexed when I would say, these are the options that you have. Which would you like to do? And they said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I gave you the options. It's for you to choose. These are X, Y, Z, ABC. Some people aren't used to that freedom of choice. Because for me, if I'm giving you a choice, it's for you to make. I give you the pluses and the minuses and you choose. Now, if it's an emergency, do not get me wrong. And that's the difference. If I've built up all of that rapport with the individual during their prenatal care or even just during their hospital care, because I would work as a hospitalist sometimes, when it's time to really get into the emergencies, they trust that I know what to do and when to do it because now I'm taking away their choice because I need to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference. If I take away their choice all of the time, then it makes a big difference in transferring that role of power. But if I give them choice and give them information and educate them that when emergencies happen, they have that trust that we've got their back and they know that they're safe.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. So where can people find your work?
Gosh, I'm kind of all over the place. So I'm all over teaching spinning babies workshops, and that you can definitely find me on the spinningbabies.com website. I will be hopefully credentialing will happen soon, and those individuals working on a credentialing team, they're just amazing. Gosh, their jobs are so hard. I will be working at Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C., taking on a role as a midwife and also working with their nutrition program there as a part of their functional nutrition team, which is so exciting for me. And then I teach undergraduate and graduate nursing education, and I will always do that because that's part of it. I got to be a part of the change, right? And I still, parent my kids and am a wife to my husband when I have time.
I like that. That's the last thing I have to say. Oh, Rhea, this has been so great. You're thoughtful with how you give this information. You're passionate about it. And I just loved hearing you speak about this. I'm deeply interested in this. And thank you for really stepping up and throwing it out there.
No problem. Thank you for having me on. I hope that I serve some justice in terms of answering what you're looking with the questions you asked me. And hopefully your audience will find value in this.
I'm sure they will. Thank you so much.
All right.
This has been an episode of Yoga Birth Babies, produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope. I'm Deb Flaschenberg. Thanks for listening.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.